back to the history of Christianity. Last time we looked at the new religions that popped up during the 19th century. We looked at Mormonism, we looked at Jehovah's Witness, and we looked at Christian Science. Today we're now going to switch gears and we're going to go back to Europe, and we're going to look at Christianity in Western Europe during the 19th century and into the 20th. And we're also going to look at the great preacher Charles Spurgeon. Stay tuned for the PowerPoint.
Okay, class, we're going to have our PowerPoint portion of this session on Western European Christianity and Charles Spurgeon. And there's a picture of Charles Spurgeon right there on the title slide. So just some introductory material. The Napoleonic Wars had left Europe in shambles. So after the French Revolution and Napoleon and the early 19th century, Europe was just in a big mess because of all the devastation and all of the issues that took place there in Europe. And out of the Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia orchestrated the peace for Europe, which was quite successful. During that century, there were only two main wars, and they were kind of short. One was the Crimean War in 1854 to 1856 between Great Britain and Russia on the Crimean Peninsula, and the other was the Franco-Prussian Wars in 1870 to 71, and that helped Germany become a nation. And we have to remember that Italy and Germany were not yet countries for most of the 19th century. It wasn't until the middle to even later portion of the 19th century that they became countries themselves. So there's four main topics that we're going to talk about in this PowerPoint before we get to Charles Spurgeon, and that is economic liberalism, new countries and revolutions, Italy and Germany will become countries, and then separation of church and state. So this lecture is kind of like bringing together a lot of the historical details that take place in Europe and how that affects the church. Okay, so economic liberalism. Please don't maybe think of this as political liberalism or that kind of an idea. This is economic liberalism, and what it is that in Europe during the 19th century, the economy was fueled by the rapidly growing class of merchants and capitalist bourgeoisie, which are the ones that a lot of times would give the capital, give the money to help the industry to be able to thrive. And economic liberalism is what is called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire means let do. And what it means is the government does not interfere with the free market. They allow the free market to set rates and adjust prices, and the government does not get involved. So the free market is what is driving the economy. And the idea was, as the Industrial Revolution grew, so would the economy. And the capital to fund the Industrial Revolution would also grow, which would basically cause a cyclical kind of movement. As industry grows, it makes more money. As more money is made, the industry can continue to grow even more. So with more growth, there would be more jobs. Therefore, the poor would improve. So that's kind of the idea. However, in the 19th century, it did not turn out that way. What happened was the Industrial Revolution grew, and the economy grew, and the rich got richer, and the poor, which is the laborers in the factories and during the Industrial Revolution, they were sapped of everything because they were paid poorly and their working conditions were poor. So this is where you think of in the 19th century the long hours of people working in factories for 18 hours a day, and children working in factories, and the rich got richer and the poor got poorer and lived in squalor. Here's two pictures of some child workers in a textile mill up there on the machinery, and then on the right is a drawing of some slums in London. And so the poor just were not doing very well. And so the question is, what is the church going to do about it? Okay, so we'll come back to that, but now we're going to move to point number 2, which is the new countries and revolutions in Europe. In 1830, Belgium became independent from the Netherlands, and that impacted the church because Belgium was Catholic and the Netherlands was Protestant. So now we have two separate countries rooted in those religions. In 1848, there were a lot of revolutions that take place in Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Switzerland, and France. And so even though there's not great wars going on, there's still revolutions taking place within countries. And I say countries, Germany and Italy are not a country yet, but just those areas, the Germanic states or the Italian states, but they will become countries. 1851, Napoleon III, who was the grandson of Napoleon Bonaparte, took over France and declared himself emperor. So now we have France kind of getting back on the European stage. And then this work called the Communist Manifesto, I'm sure you've heard of that before, was published by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And obviously this is the basis for communism. That's Karl Marx there on the right with the big beard. And that impacts the church because communism is just at the base level, it's atheistic. And Communist Manifesto really does take root during the late 19th century. And then when we get into the 20th century with the Russian Revolution and going all the way after World War II with the what we would say is like the Soviet Union of the Cold War era, very atheistic. Okay, number 3 in our list is Italy and Germany. They do become countries. There are power struggles of who controlled the various Italian states. So we're looking at Italy right now. In 1849, as European revolution spread, the Papal States developed. You may have heard of that, the Papal States, where it's basically the church, the Roman Catholic Church's lands were collected together near Rome, and they were vast, and they were called the Papal States. The Italian states were in turmoil with European influence causing great issues. So Rome declared itself a republic, and Pope Pius IX called on Napoleon III, who's in France, for help. So we have this Italian state that is controlled by the Pope, and which is basically Rome and the areas surrounding it, and he calls on Napoleon III, who's French, for help. Well, with the French protection, the Papal States were declared independent. So that gives the Pope pretty much a nice basis there in Italy. When France and Germany went to war in 1870, King Victor Emmanuel of Italy, he ended up unifying the country. So while France and Germany are up there doing their thing in Europe, going to war, then Victor Emmanuel unifies the country of Italy. And what happens is in this unification, the papal land is actually reduced over time. Numerous issues would follow for many years, and then and the lands were given and things like that. 1929, the papacy agrees to give up the vast papal lands, and the Roman Catholic Church would remain in what is called Vatican City. And so here's a map there on the right of Vatican City. It's very small. You can see on the legend down here, it's only 0.3 miles is that line. So it's not a very large area, but it's this is all papal controlled, land controlled by the papacy. And so you see St. Peter's Square and the Basilica Museum. There's other buildings, the Papal Gardens, and I have another picture here. So there you go. Here's the St. Peter's Basilica, the Papal Gardens back there. Okay, so I'll just go back one. So St. Peter's Square with this round circle right there. So that area there is kind of like an independent little area controlled by the Pope. Okay, now Germany, Otto von Bismarck united the Germanic state after political movements and several short wars. And the political movement is called realpolitik, and that basically means he would do whatever it takes politically. He would step on anyone he could as long as he was able to move his agenda forward. That's called realpolitik. And if you were a student in my World History 2 class for Mid-America, we spent a good amount of time on Bismarck and realpolitik. And that's him there on the right with the pointy helmet, which is called a pickleaub. So he's over there on the right. Bismarck believed Protestantism would be the best for Germany, which was the religion of Prussia, which was the largest state. And so if you think about the Germanic states as before they became a country under Bismarck, they were a lot of little states, but Prussia was definitely the largest, had the largest military, and obviously the most influence. And so the religion of Prussia was Protestant. So basically Germany was going to become Protestant, which was predominantly Lutheran. Also, he did have a sour relation with Austria, which was Catholic. So it was definitely going to be a Protestant country when Germany becomes a country. But that does not mean there were not other religions. Like Catholics were there. It's not that they were all gone. Catholics were there, but it was predominantly a Protestant nation. Okay, separation of church and state. Prior to the Napoleonic era, there was a unity of church and state. So pretty much everything was done together. The church, the state, all influenced one another. They were intertwined. But then during the tumultuous aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was reestablishing itself, and as it comes out of this reestablishing, the church and state began to separate. Even if a country was Catholic or Lutheran or etc., the church and state were distancing themselves from each other. And what happens is we have this rise of what we call free churches. And this is what you would probably think of maybe a church today, free churches. And free churches were churches that were developed where people, number one, you see it here on the screen, they voluntarily joined. Okay, so they weren't forced to join or they weren't made to join because it was their country's religion or something like that. They voluntarily joined. They gave offerings to support the church rather than state funds. So if it was a state church, the government would give the church money, but a free church means that the people give money in offerings or tithes to support the church. The free churches, they saw a need for piety, and they also wanted to serve God without the shadow of the state over them. So these churches that rose up were called free churches. They really began to make an impact on the European lands because more and more of them grew up out of the 19th century turmoil that was going to really establish the modern European state. Okay, let's just talk just real quick about Great Britain because of how influential they are, especially during the missions movement of the 19th century. But Great Britain, they had high industrialization, which means there was rapid growth of industry and rapid growth of workers. And what happens is the workers who are poor, they get overcrowded in slums. It's very dirty. There's a lot of disease, not a lot of money. A lot of the higher class ignored them, and so there was a lot of problems in the slums. So for more opportunities, many immigrated to the United States. And there on the screen is a picture of Ellis Island. In the foreground, this big square island is Ellis Island, and then back here is Liberty Island with the Statue of Liberty. And so all the ships coming from Europe would come in, and this right here is the dock. The big ship would pull into this waterway right here and anchor, and then all the immigrants would get off and be processed in the buildings and then sent to New York, over to the New York City, which is right there near Ellis Island. So the church had to deal with all of these immigrants coming in, and so we see the social organizations popping up, which we talked about previously, YMCA, YWCA, other organizations to deal with all of the all the people. But in Great Britain, they also had to deal with the overcrowded slums and taking care of the people. And the YMCA and other organizations, they worked hard in Great Britain to help those people. YMCA, YWCA, they were both founded in London. We also see in Great Britain there's a poor state of the Church of England. The Church of England had split off of the Catholic Church under Henry VIII, and he became the head of the Church of England, and then the monarchy remained the head of the Church of England. And we see some things in the Church of England in the 19th century that remind you of the Catholic Church. We see absenteeism, where the bishops of the Church of England are not in their parishes; they're off doing their thing, and the people in the parishes are just left to almost fend for themselves under clergy who might have been doing their own thing. So you have absenteeism. There was abuse of church offices going back to simony and nepotism that you think of the Catholic Church. Well, it was occurring in the Church of England. And then there was a type of split that occurred. There were those in the Church of England that were closer to what you would say is like Protestantism, and trying to worship God in that vein, like the Protestants. But then there were those who, many of them were actually from Oxford, that they wanted to move the Church of England closer to Catholic beliefs and Catholic practices. And they were actually called Anglo-Catholics. And again, this is in the Church of England, so there was like this division going on in regards to how to worship and what to believe. So the poor state of the Church of England was in Great Britain. And then there's they abolished slavery. In 1806 and 1811, laws to abolish the slave trade occurred. 1833, all slaves in the British Caribbean were freed, and we've already talked about slavery, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But you see, Great Britain is progressing here during the 19th century to get rid of slaves, and they were the one of the first countries to actually abolish slavery. Okay, so now we're just going to switch gears just a little bit, and we're going to talk about an Englishman, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, 1834 to 1892, and you may have heard of him. You might know a lot about him. He is a very famous preacher, and so we're just going to talk about him because he had such a great impact on 19th century Christianity, especially Protestantism, and definitely in London, but also around the world. Just some information about his early life. He was saved at 15 years old in a primitive Methodist chapel, and then he was baptized in the Lark River. And he began preaching at 19 years old. After 3 months of preaching, he became the pastor of New Park Street Chapel, which had been founded in 1650. So he's a very young pastor, and he is now in the pulpit of a very old church. So he's got a big responsibility ahead of him. But God had gifted him with the ability to preach. He was an exceptional preacher, and he's known as the Prince of Preachers today. In 1856, he started the Pastors' College to teach pastors how to minister and preach. And it was a very successful college, and pastors around the world, they wanted to come to this college to be trained by Spurgeon. The congregation exploded in growth because he was such a great preacher and the Holy Spirit was moving on the people, and the congregation really grew. October 7th, 1857, he preached to over 23,000 people, and because it was such a large crowd, they actually held that at the Crystal Palace, which was this gigantic structure a lot of it was glass, and again, back in 1857, that was kind of a rarity to have such everything made of glass. It was like an iron structured building with glass panes all around it, and so they called it the Crystal Palace. He moved the church to the Metropolitan Tabernacle, which is still there today, and it's still there today preaching the gospel. So, and that's a very famous church. It's Spurgeon's church. Sometimes it's called Spurgeon's church, but it's called the Metropolitan Tabernacle. And at the tabernacle, they produced it began at first with just almost like a church bulletin, but then it kind of went to like a pamphlet and it was called the Sword and Trowel, and it went for many decades that they published this for the people, and then yearly it would be collected and bound into books, and it's called the Sword and Trowel. What the Sword and Trowel was, it was everything from stories about what's going on in the church to little articles to even Spurgeon's sermons being produced so that people could read the sermons later on, and they were all put together and then bound, and they're very valuable today for all the richness that is in them from Spurgeon's ministry. Numerous church organizations and societies popped up out of the Metropolitan Tabernacle to help deal with the 19th century city squalor and slums. There were trying to help the people and, of course, bring the gospel to the people while they were helping them. There were orphanages that were set up. A lot of different ministries came out of the Metropolitan Tabernacle under Spurgeon's leadership. He was involved in a situation called the downgrade controversy, and this was a fight that he took to the liberals, the theological liberals, because the liberals were attacking the sola scriptura, sola, and so the liberals were saying that basically it was the higher critics were saying that the Bible had errors, the Bible. The miracles were not true in the Bible. It was a lot of stories were just stories for effect, but they were not real They were not real events in the Bible. And so that's the higher critics were saying this, and so Spurgeon fought against this, and it's called the downgrade controversy. And it was how churches and theologians were allowing evolution and higher criticism into these churches. If you do a study of the higher critics of the Bible, it was almost always certain that the higher critics were in some way believers in Charles Darwin's evolution. And this was creeping into the church, and Spurgeon really fought against it. There's a picture there of the Metropolitan Tabernacle. And again, it's still there today, and it still kind of looks the same today with the big pillars out front. He died at 57 years old from kidney failure, and he was one of the greatest preachers and defenders of the faith. And so there's a good picture of him smiling there. And I just wanted to point out that Mid-America Library holds several 19th century sword and trowel volumes in its rare book collection. So if you're at the seminary, or if you ever come to the seminary, if you're online, the rare book collection, we have several volumes of original sword and trowel they bound these papers together to make them into a book, and they're quite rare and quite valuable. Okay, so that's it for Western European Christianity and Charles Spurgeon. I'll see you in a second.
Okay, class, that's it for today. Next time we'll be looking at Eastern Christianity. See you next time.